resources of the Iranian people to do this, even as it denies their human rights and fundamental freedoms. When the United States takes a stand against this regime, even an unpopular stand, we're sending an important message to the Iranian people. We are telling them that the United States supports their desire for a better future. We are telling them we will not look the other way while their government steals from their children in order to finance terrorism abroad. That message resonates wherever we stand up for our values, in Syria, in South Sudan, in Venezuela, in North Korea. When the United States challenges dictators, we are telling the people suffering under them that they have worth and dignity. We are telling them that we acknowledge their worth, even if their government refuses to do so. We are telling them that a better life is possible. In the end, this is how the United States can solve the challenge of having to work with undemocratic regimes at the UN. We don't have to abandon our principles. We can bring about change by talking over the heads of tyrants directly to the people. We have a very powerful and a very hopeful message to convey, but we have to have the confidence and the will to convey it. And this brings me to the final point I want to talk about. It has less to do with America in the world than America here at home. Sometimes I worry that we're losing sight of the power of our values in the world. We seem on the verge of allowing our differences here at home to cause us to lose confidence in the message of the American idea. And if we can't believe in the principles that unite us, it's difficult for others to be inspired by those principles. We all have a point of view. We all have beliefs and perspectives that we hold dear. But in our politics, on our campuses, and in the media, we're not listening to each other. We're focusing on our differences rather than what brings us together. And we're digging in. We increasingly view those who disagree with us not just as wrong, but as evil. We don't try to understand our opponents. Too often we just write them off as not even fit to have a conversation with, much less come to an agreement with. But this reflects a very limited understanding, not just of American politics, but of international politics. In the last year, working in depth in foreign relations, I have seen true evil, and it's not in the American political system. In South Sudan, where rape is routinely used as a weapon of war, that is evil. In Syria, where the dictator uses chemical weapons to murder innocent children, that is evil. In Iran, where the regime tortures political prisoners at home and sponsors terrorism abroad, that is evil. But American politics is not the international arena. As governor of South Carolina, I had political battles with other officials who I disagreed with. Some were in the other party, some were in my own party. We had real differences about what was best for our state and her people, mostly on taxes, spending, and the role of government. But that was nothing compared to sitting across the negotiating table from representatives of regimes that commit genocide, governments that starve their own people to fund illegal weapons programs, and dictators who use the torture of children as a political weapon. Those of you interested in American politics or public service should keep this in mind. Real leadership is bringing others around to your point of view by showing them how it is in their best interest to do so. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger gave me some of my best advice as U.S. Ambassador. He said to bring people around to your position, you have to first imagine yourself in their shoes. You have to understand how they see the world and what they want. Then you can concentrate on showing how your position is beneficial to them. If we can do that with foreign leaders, we certainly can do that with fellow Americans. So if you take away one message today, take away this. Here at home, our political opponents are not our enemies, and they're not evil. They're just our opponents. Take it from me, there's a big difference. And if we can't keep that difference straight, we're going to have a hard time conveying a message of hope to the world. America is a great nation, not because of who we are, but because of what we believe. The proof is in those people suffering in prisons in Cuba, starving in Venezuela, or hiding in basements in Syria. America carries the hope of freedom that is in their hearts, and it is that hope that sustains them. We can never forget this. Our values will always be our most powerful foreign policy tool. We must never hesitate to lead with them. That the daughter of Indian immigrants now has the privilege of representing the United States at the United Nations is a testament to the power of our message. I will never stop being inspired by the example of America, and I will never stop being its loud and proud messenger to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Taff. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Board of Regents for the University of Houston, and on behalf of the university system, we appreciate everyone here, and of course, we very much appreciate you, Ambassador Haley, for being here today and for that excellent speech.
Thank you.
So I wanted to cover in our time together kind of three topics, or three broad topics. And first would be your background, and particularly the decision that you made as you were in South Carolina to enter into public service. It's taken you from a state legislative position to now being ambassador.
So, you know, when I was running for governor, I always started every speech with one sentence, and that was that I am the proud daughter of Indian immigrants who reminded my brothers, my sister, and me every day how blessed we were to be in this country. And the reason that I did that is because my parents truly believed and preached to us, whatever you do, be great at it and make sure that people remember you for it. So they left India and very wealthy lifestyles and came to the U.S. with $8 in their pocket to start over, because only in America could you truly have the opportunities and achieve your dreams if you worked hard for it. And so learning that was always how I was brought up. I started doing the books for my family's business when I was 12. It wasn't till I got to Clemson that I realized that wasn't normal. But through that process, I really learned about the value of $1. And during tough times, you know, you made sure that you got smart and you were focused on how you could thin things out. And during good times, you never celebrated, because you knew the bad times would come again. Through all of that, I became an accountant, went to Clemson, was not involved in politics at all, was not involved in student government, not involved in any of those things that I see so many smart kids involved in now. So I went on to be an accountant, worked for a corporate company, and then came back home to the family business. And the one thing I kept saying to my mom was, I can't believe how hard it is to make $1 and how easy it is for government to take it. And my mom said, quit complaining about it, do something about it. I truly, ignorance is bliss, I did not know you weren't supposed to run against a 30-year incumbent in a primary. But once we got in, the only option was to win. And we defeated the longest-serving legislator by going and knocking on doors and not disparaging him, but talking about how the State House had way too many lawyers and they needed an accountant. And that really was how I got involved in politics.
So today is a runoff election day here in Texas. And so how many elections did you compete in, and how many did you win?
So when I ran for the State House, I also had a runoff. I won 2 more times after that, and then I ran for governor, and I won again, had a runoff there as well. Won the first term and then won re-election. So enough times to know you got to be a little bit crazy to do this.
Okay, well, and then I wanted to cover one of the things that we hear, any kind of viewer of the news hears about the UN Security Council and the General Assembly, and I think, at least me speaking, I don't necessarily understand the structure. We know Congress, we know House and Senate and President, but I don't think there, no one sits down and explains to the general public exactly how the UN functions. We know the Security Council is a big deal, and then the General Assembly. So if you could just kind of go through and just give a general overview of the UN and how it operates.
Absolutely, because before I took this position, I didn't know that either, for what it's worth. There are 193 countries that are members of the United Nations. But the one that you see me mostly speaking in or on TV is the Security Council. And the Security Council is the council that's supposed to deal with peace and security. It has 15 members. 5 members are permanent. They're on the council. There's no running for an election. They stay on the council. That's the U.S., UK, China, Russia. U.S., UK, China, Russia, France. Thank you.
Sorry.
God bless the French. They're going to forgive me for that. So those 5, what makes them different is they have the power of the veto. So when I tell you that we've had 12 resolutions trying to condemn Assad in Syria, even though the majority of the council, I think the other 14 members were in favor, Russia vetoed it. So those 5 members are incredibly powerful when it comes to international decisions. The other 10 members are elected to 2-year terms. They run in the whole 193 to get that 2-year term. And so that makes up the Security Council. So the players change every year based on where they are in their terms. But it is, in some ways, it can do really good things, like what we were able to do with North Korea. And in some ways, it can be unbelievably frustrating, like what we haven't been able to do in Syria.
And is it like Congress? Is there a session that y'all are in session? Is it continual, or is it structured in some way?
So the program of work, we're usually in council 4 days a week. That's all year long. And then depending on whether there are emergency cases like the Israeli-Palestinian issue, whether North Korea has a test, any of those things, we will have extra sessions on top of that.
And then we also hear about non-binding resolutions and sanctions, and I'm going to ask you about later about some of the sanctions issues. But what type of enforcement powers does the United Nations have when they decide someone's doing something wrong and they want to enforce some type of punishment?
Well, and I think that's the part that maybe I struggle with the most, is the accountability aspect. In some ways, it works really well. So in North Korea, when we passed those 3 sanctions, cutting off 90% of their trade, 30% of their oil, stopping all investments going in and out of North Korea, we rallied the international community to do that. We have little triggers that we'll try and see if anybody is breaking that or not doing exactly what they're supposed to. But at the end of the day, it's up to each one of those countries to have the will to do the right thing. And, in the case of North Korea, they all did it. China really stepped up. They could have done more, but they did a really good job. And so I think, for the most part, getting the will is really good. When you see, for example, chemical weapons use in Syria, and you see that Assad getting away with it and nothing coming down to actually hurt him, that's the problem. But that's usually because of a veto. That's usually because one member state is stopping it.
And then you referenced Secretary Kissinger. Was he one of your role models as far as getting you up to speed and getting advice on how to operate? And then or were there other role models?
I think I really talked to all of the ambassadors. Condi Rice was great, Madeleine Albright. has reached out. John Bolton was one. Henry Kissinger, I've learned so much from. I'm reading Jean Kirkpatrick's book just to pull out anything that I can. Samantha Power was very gracious to me before I took this position. So you try and grab everything that you can. When you're in a position like this, you never know everything. It's a constant learning curve to really be able to get it all in. But the best way to really know how to deal with things is to listen and understand. And when I mentioned in the speech about what Dr. Kissinger did, when he told me you have to put yourself in their shoes, you have to understand their motivations and how they think, he told me that when we were negotiating North Korea. And it's so true because I, from a U.S. perspective, can say to China, well, you should do this because it's the right thing to do. But by putting yourself in China's shoes and thinking like they do, you realize they don't do short-term things, they do long-term things. They're concerned about North Korea, and they're more concerned about North Korea being destabilized because then all of the North Koreans will come into China. So you have to understand what is it that they're scared of, what is it that they worry about, and then you take your solutions and you work that into the negotiations so that they feel more confident about it.
And so what are some of your goals as you serve as the ambassador to the United Nations?
Coming into this position, and I think what I still continue to have, is I want to be a strong American voice. I think it's hugely important that countries not wonder what our position is. We need to be very black and white. We don't need to have gray. They need to know what we're doing, and they need to know what we expect. That way they can make good decisions. And so having that strong American voice is important. I've also found that the United Nations is a great place to negotiate. Interestingly enough, while the U.S. doesn't respect the United Nations so much, every other country in the world, it's the end goal. So the person that's the ambassador at the United Nations is the senior most diplomat that's the most trusted by their president. So I could easily negotiate with one of the ambassadors, and they could get on the phone with their president that same day and get something done. So I found a world of extra value just by being able to negotiate and get things done very quickly that we can do with the United Nations. So I try and do that all with the idea to also work on reform. You know, one of the things we saw, and you'll hear, we spend a ton of money at the United Nations. $9 billion a year we spend. $5 billion of that is voluntary, but the rest is money that the U.S. gives. And in order to really get value on investment, I started digging into what we spend. We pay 28% of the peacekeeping budget, and those peacekeeping missions around the world are warranted. In some cases, they really are to keep peace and to balance a situation or to lift up a country so that they no longer need security. But what we found when we started going through all of those negotiations, when they were being renewed, we saw that usually when there's a crisis, the Security Council would just throw more soldiers at it. They'd throw more people thinking that that would fix the crisis. But they never checked to see if those soldiers were trained, if they had the right equipment, and were able to actually do the mandate. And so by doing that, we were able to actually save $700 million this past year in peacekeeping, and we made those missions better because we armed the soldiers with what they needed. We made sure the mandates were doable, that they could actually be successful at, and those missions are now working more effectively. So things like that we're trying to do just to bring more value back to the American people.
And roughly, where does that $9 billion, what is it spent for besides the peacekeeping function?
So you have $2 to $3 billion that's spent on peacekeeping, and then you've got $5 billion that goes to $2 billion that goes to other things within the budget, and then $5 billion we spend on voluntary. It's the World Food Program. It's things that we do to help other countries when they're in need, for vaccinations, for food, for health care, all of those things.
And what's the UN's overall budget?
I don't know. I'll have to get back to you. It's way too much, I can tell you that.
Like what percentage of it would you estimate?
So we pay 22% of the regular budget, and then we pay 28% of the peacekeeping budget. So there's a large portion that we pay, and when you think about the America bashing that takes place at the United Nations. That's the reason I think we push back in the terms of at least give us the respect. We've got it in New York. We're hosting you. We're doing all of these things. We're giving you all of this money. The America bashing, don't do it just because you can. And so I think we're trying to balance that out a little bit.
We've seen, you didn't see this, but there's some great pictures of you behind us, or behind you while you were speaking. Some of those, you were clearly at refugee camps around the world. And I understand you've been to at least Jordan, Turkey, Ethiopia, and the Congo. So can you tell us, I don't know, how those came about, what the circumstances were, why you went, and what you learned, and what our role is there?
So I don't go to the pretty places. I typically go to the places where there's a lot of suffering and a lot of challenges. And my first trip actually was to Jordan and Turkey, because what we saw in the Syrian conflict, it had gone into its 7th year by the time I got there, and all of the talk was about Syrian refugees, and I wanted to see what the state of the situation is and what the United States could further do to help. What's miraculous is the way that Jordan and Turkey are hosting those Syrian refugees is remarkable. They are making sure that, and they're actually taking quite a bit of pressure for doing so. They're now double shifting schools. Jordanians go to school in the morning, Syrians go to school in the afternoon, same with the Turks. They're giving them full health care. They have provided them a safe place to live. And in turn, Syrians are becoming part of that economy in the way that they do that. You go on the other situation where we were looking and met with South Sudanese refugees as well as those from Congo. Totally different situation. They're not being educated. They don't have health care. They're not safe. They're still very targeted. And so you look at both of those, and what does that mean in terms of refugees? Well, you've got the Syrian refugees, and while they are traumatized by what they've seen, they basically can be productive. They can go further. They want to go back and rebuild, and we'll see them do that. The concern about the South Sudanese and the Congolese refugees is they're angry, they're resentful, and they're uneducated. And so what happens when those kids grow up? That's what we have to think about. Education is going to be key in all of these challenging areas, especially as we're seeing migration happen. If you look at Venezuela, you're seeing that almost 1 million people have gone into the country of Colombia. What they experience when they get out of those situations hugely impacts who they're going to be and who the future leaders are going to be. So refugee camps can really tell you a lot, but they can also show you the challenges of why environment matters and what we need to do. I will tell you what's fascinating. Even though they all left unbelievably dangerous places, when you ask them what they wanted, above it all, they just want to go home. Even if their home is in shambles, they just want to go home.
Going to North Korea, can you describe, you spoke about it some with me and also in your initial comments, but can you talk about that? I mean, for anyone who's kind of new to following the news, that may seem like an ordinary thing that ambassadors do, but I sense that it is not quite so ordinary. So can you discuss just the process of when you got on the job, taking us through to where you accomplished those sanctions?
So getting sanctions on North Korea was difficult. Most of the countries agreed that the nuclear testing that they were doing was a threat. They agreed that it was wrong. They agreed that their situation and the way they were dealing with human rights and how they were targeting and abducting those from Japan and just all the behavior that was wrong, they all acknowledged it. But when you talk about doing sanctions in the UN, in the Security Council, what those countries think about is, but what if they eventually want to do this to us? So you're not just dealing with it on merit, they're always thinking back to, but they could turn around and do this to us. So it's a very hard mountain to climb in the first place. Basically, my issues in trying to get those North Korean sanctions through were going to be China and Russia. China, because North Korea is right next to them, they didn't want to upset them. They wanted to try and find a balance in dealing with the situation. Russia, just because they go against everything we do. So with China, what we tried to do was really leverage the situation in terms of what their situation was. We knew that they were worried about a destabilized North Korea. We knew about the pressures they felt like that would put on China. We knew about the idea that they didn't want war in the region. And so a lot of the sanctions that we did, even though we squeezed China and they knew they hurt, the truth is I would always use the unpredictability of President Trump to help me get the sanctions through. So I would say, we have to cut off the laborers. We have to do this. And they'd say, no, we can't do that. And I would say, okay, but I can't promise you that President Trump won't use the military. I can't promise that there won't be a more forceful action. So why can't we do this and see if we can start to cut the revenue in North Korea? So it was through that we did the 3 sanctions. And by the time I got China to agree to pass those sanctions and I'd get the other countries to agree, then I just told Russia this is getting ready to happen. And we just kind of pushed them out of the way.
So going back to that process where you were operating in kind of a legislative type of negotiations at the highest levels, how was that similar to your background both as a legislator and then as an executive in South Carolina?
I think the negotiation style I've found is very much the same. You have to find where your leverage is. You have to push the envelope. And you have to make sure that you know what your end goal is at the end of the day. And so through that, I found that very much the negotiations I would do as governor, whether it was recruiting a company or whether it was dealing with the legislature, is very similar as what we see in the international community. You're just dealing with a few more dangerous actors in the process, but it is still the same type of negotiation skills.
And so what's your typical day? I mean, I know there's no typical, but what would be a kind of typical week, say, for you these days?
There is no typical day or typical week. You have your schedule as it's planned, and it's never what I expect it to be because something comes up. Usually you do plan on going to Security Council meetings. I will start the day by getting my son sleepily out the door, go into work, meet with everyone at the office to talk about the day, talk about the issues that we're going to have, go into the Security Council, and usually we'll have lots of meetings with different ambassadors where we try and negotiate different issues. One day a week, usually I will go to D.C., and that's where we'll have White House meetings. And usually in those White House meetings, we're meeting with the National Security Council, deciding on what the policy is going to be in dealing with these foreign policy efforts. So it's all over the place. Sometimes I'm here talking to university students, and then sometimes we are negotiating a deal up in New York, but either way, it's never boring.
So your family moved to New York when you took the job?
Yes, so my husband is a combat veteran in the military. He is on orders in South Carolina, so we do weekend dating. We always meet in the middle on the weekends. My daughter has just finished her sophomore year in college, and she's getting ready to be a junior. And then my son is 16 in 10th grade. And he loves his life in the city. I never knew he'd be a city kid, but he loves it.
So I know you can't, we'd all love if we knew, but what do you see? What's next on the horizon? What kind of challenges do you anticipate coming over the horizon besides the ones we know?
Well, obviously North Korea, we've got the summit coming forward on June 12th. This is, keep in mind, a summit that Kim asked for. And so when we look at that, all the preparations are being made for the logistics, where, when, and what the end goal is supposed to be. So that is obviously one issue. The second one is Iran. You look at the idea that we just disassociated with the JCPOA. So now we are in talks with our European partners and with other partners on what we want to see from Iran and what we think needs to happen. I think that you will see, while some countries don't like it, They can't deny the fact that Iran is doing ballistic missile testing that they're not supposed to be, that they are supporting terrorism that they're not supposed to, and that they also are doing arms sales, like to Yemen, when they give it to the Houthis. And so they do acknowledge that they've not been the best actor. The thing is, we gave them a lot of money on the front end with the promise that they would be a good actor, and now they've got the money and they've been not so much of a good actor. So trying to get them back into a situation, much like North Korea, where we can get to a negotiation, I think you'll see that happen. I think with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that's one that's had peaks and valleys, but at the end of the day, we genuinely want to see a peace solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think the goal right now is to get President Abbas to come to the table. He's been very rigid and very stubborn in terms of doing that, but the Arab countries want to see him come to the table. And I think that's a negotiation that will happen. We just have to wait for tensions to come down a little bit so that we can do that. So I think those are just three. You look at Africa and Democratic Republic of Congo, you've got a lot of suffering there, but we have really pushed forward for elections, free and fair elections. That's supposed to happen in December. If that happens, that will be amazing. And then obviously South Sudan, we're trying to figure out how to get that one to where the fighting stops, the people are lifted up, and it's not so dangerous. And then we can't forget everything that's happening in Cuba, and then you look at Venezuela and the devastation that has happened in Venezuela from a very thriving country with a lot of opportunity to now where 90% of the people in Venezuela don't know where their next meal is going to come from. So there's no shortage of issues in the world.
So we have some students here. What advice would you give a student who wanted to pursue, let's start with an international type career in your field, in your current field?
All right, so keep in mind I'm an accountant, and so had no foreign policy experience, no political science experience. I say that to you to tell you that the sky really is the limit. What allows you to do any job, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's in politics, whether it's in anything else, is the will to want to do it and the motivation to really want to improve the lives of people around you. If you had that will and you had that motivation and that passion, then all you have to do is be able to communicate that. And it's the communication that I think is the most important skill, because you have to be able to let people know who you are, what you believe in, and why you would make a difference. And if you do that, really, I don't think there's any background as much as I think you have to have the will and the motivation to want to do it.
And just for maybe a student who doesn't, know what they want to do, what would be your take on the value of kind of the international experience? Houston is one of the most diverse cities in the country, and so we like to say that is a tremendous value add by going to school here. But can you comment on that? What you've seen? Possibly that wasn't something you thought of when you were, 22, going back to...
I didn't, but I can tell you foreign policy is the wave of the future, because countries are interacting more, we're dealing with more issues on an international level, and we're going to continue to see that, whether that's in trade and business and the way we grow our economies together, whether that's fighting terrorism and the way we're doing intelligence sharing with different countries, or whether it's just that we're dealing with challenges and crises in different regions of the world. It's a fascinating field to be in, because if you look at peace and security, we can never look at peace and security in a United States bubble. We are dependent on peace and security around the world to ensure that we're going to be safe. So we have to care about foreign policy. We have to care about other countries. It's easy to say, we're just going to take care of Americans. We're not going to worry about anybody else. But what about those uneducated, resentful kids in South Sudan? What happens when they grow up? What threat is that on us? What happens when Syria finally comes together and where the Iranian threat that we have? What happens if we just walked away from that? They would already start to take over the region and we'd start to see more terrorism. We have to care about what happens in the world. And so foreign policy is one way that not only can you make a difference for your country, but you're making a difference for other people who deserve the same quality of life as you do.
So we saw those photographs, and you've done some cool things since you've been on the job. But what do you think will stand out when you're 80 years old and recounting things? What are some of the stories or some of the experiences that you've had that have really made an impact on you and just over the course of the past year?
I think there's not any place that I've been that I didn't feel an impact. And one thing that I always do in every place is I meet with women. Closed doors, men out of the room, no press, and just ask them about situations. And what always fascinates me, regardless of the area, regardless of the crisis, they have the ability to communicate what the problem is, what they need, and how to fix it. And so I have found so much value in that. But I think the one thing that sticks with me is recently when we were in South Sudan, and I was speaking to our group of women, and they were basically talking about, we were asking them what they needed and how we could be helpful. And one of the women started to speak, and she started to talk about what she had gone through. And she talked about the fact that these groups had come in and they shot members of her family, they raped her repeatedly, they threw her baby in a fire, and all of a sudden the rest of the women started crying because they all had the same story. They had all had to go through that same type of trauma. And so when you find out that they've gone through things we can't even stomach, it's unbelievable. This other woman, as we're walking through the refugee camp, she starts having a panic attack